What's up, everybody? I'm Metal Nick,
I'm Jeff Grindstoffer.
and welcome to episode number 100 of Vinyl Bang. 100. I
Ooh,
can't believe we
100.
made it. 100 episodes, right?
100 weeks of my life that I'll never get back. But I am so excited for how this has all turned out. Yes, yes.
But for 100, we brought out the big guns. Jeff, please introduce today's guest.
For our landmark 100th episode, ladies and gentlemen, this guy, okay, the thing is, every time we introduce a band, every time we introduce a special guest, we always go through the list of bands and try to cover all the highlights. As far as our guests' projects. And the other day, whenever I went through it, I swear there were like 72 projects. And today, whenever I went through it again, I swear to God, there were three more projects added. It's insane how many bands this guy is in. I'm going to try, and honestly, ladies and gentlemen, this is a fraction, a small fraction of bands that Dirk Verbeuren has been in. Let's cover Bent C, Blood from the Soul, Kill Division, Megadeth, Savage Lands, the Project Hate, MCM. I don't even know what year, what Roman numeral for a year this is, but we'll get into that in a minute. And Venture, and that's a small fraction of the current bands that Dirk is in. Previous bands: Aborted, Art Sonic, Devin Townsend Project, Hootie and the Blowfish, Mortuary, One Way Mirror, Scarve, and Soilwork Kids, okay, for guest appearances. And this is, again, not even scratching the surface of the bands that this guy has been in. Archives, Chapang, Lamb of God, you did vocals on the track Omens, Malevolence, and Sublime Cadaveric Decomposition. Look it up. Look up how many bands this guy is. It would take an hour to go over everything. And I am so glad we do not conduct interviews, because questions about all of these bands, I could just spend days asking questions about these bands. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Dirk Verbeuren.
Hell yeah.
100 episodes, Dirk Verbeuren. Thank you so much for taking time out to do this, because I'm sure you're probably going to start another band after this is done. So let's just get right past all this and get right into it. Thank you, Dirk.
Thanks, Jeff and Nick, and thanks for having me. It's an honor. Congrats to you both for 100 episodes. We're all record lovers, so it's great. It's great. I'm happy to be a part of it. I just gotta say one thing after your intro. Hootie and the Blowfish? What list was that on?
The internet lied to me again. Damn it.
Yeah, I did, because I definitely never played with them, but yeah, that's all I'll say about that. But yeah, so records. Uh, so let's kick it off, shall we?
Hell yeah.
Yes, please. Let's hear about some albums, Dirk.
All right, albums. So the first one I gotta start with is the first album I ever bought. I was probably about 9 years old when I got Purple Rain by Prince, and I remember my dad walking me into the record store and being like, "What do you want to buy? Here, why don't you buy your own album?" And he handed me like whatever it was at the time, 10 Belgian francs or whatever. I still lived in Belgium at the time, and that's what I chose. And so Prince has been a big influence of mine throughout my life, not just musically, but also for what he represents as far as a guy that plays all the instruments, that writes all the music. That's a total, the ultimate rock star in the way he is on stage and in life and in general. So I've always been fascinated by him. That's never changed since I was young. And I would say that Prince is an underlying kind of ground zero motivational factor for me becoming a musician, for sure.
Very cool. Very cool. And that makes sense. I mean, after I went through your catalog and started looking into it, I was like, a lot of these projects, I mean, some of them you've spearheaded, like the Bent C, I believe is that's your baby, correct?
Yeah, correct.
And that's awesome. And just your ability to do guitars and bass and everything. It makes sense that you would look up to Prince in that aspect. That he just, a one man utility guy, I guess would be the
Jack
way
of
to
all
word that.
trades.
Yeah, yeah, that makes
Absolutely.
perfect sense, Dirk.
Yeah, just someone who didn't stop at anything to get his art across, and who was incredibly productive. And I would say the closest I've gotten to someone like that in my own kind of path is working with Devin Townsend, because he's very much like,
Hmm.
Yeah,
has the creativity and the instrumental ability and the vision that Prince had, of course, in his very own Devin way. But working with him, I've been through some moments and had some experiences with him where I was like, this is probably what it was like to be with Prince in like 1984 or 83 in the studio, just being like, what is happening right now,
right.
Hell yeah.
So yeah. But
Right
yeah,
on.
so that's and Purple Rain, obviously, it's one of the penultimate albums Prince made, but there's so many that are great. It's what's funny
Sure.
about this is like, I was going through records here, and you'll see for some artists I have two, because I just couldn't pick one. It's and it's very hard to select when you have 35 years, or in my case, actually, I should say my entire life I've just been around music. I grew up with my parents playing music, the radio, a lot of classical music, a lot of vinyl and whatever they had at the time. So it's just been part of my life. So to make a small selection in there is excruciatingly difficult.
Sure, sure. No, no, absolutely. And there's been guests that we've had on where they're like, it was so hard to pick out, enough to fill out an hour. I could talk about 5 hours, and by all means, one of these days, if it came down to it, we would have you back on for part two. I mean, it's hard to narrow it down, and that's why I'm so lucky that a part of the show. I can just talk about albums forever. Like I got 3 more albums today that I want to talk about. So it's like I understand that
Yep.
it's hard to narrow it down.
Yep.
So.
Absolutely. I tried to make selections that, kind of trace my path, that were really, that stood out at that moment in my life. So the next one that I have, oh, there's two.
Awesome.
I'm gonna start with this one because that's like the main one I would say at the time is the first Beastie Boys album, License to Ill, and then the next one after that, Paul's Boutique. By the way, a lot of these are like, this is the one I bought or I got gifted at the time. A colleague of my dad's gifted this one to me because I guess my dad told him that I was like crazy about the Fight for Your Right and No Sleep Till Brooklyn videos featuring Kerry King, by the way. First time I
Sure.
heard, Kerry King play was not in Slayer, but in Beastie Boys. And so these records, became like, especially License to Ill, that was when I was about probably 11 years old. And my parents had given me their old stereo to put in my bedroom, and I think I had License to Ill on the turntable probably for like a year, listening to it every day, maybe multiple times a day, and and I think that one was important because I think it's kind of the root of my passion for drums, because that music is so beat driven. And English, I spoke English already a bit at the time, but a lot of the lyrics went over my head at that age. Of course, some of the silly stuff I understood, but a lot of it was way past my brain. But it was the music, it was the beat, the drive, the rhythmic aspect of the vocals. That's
Sure.
really what drew me into rap and hip hop at the time. I could have picked any old Public Enemy album, Run DMC, LL Cool J, you name it, and WA a few years later. All those things were super instrumental to me around the time, or a few years before I really got into metal. And that's when I really, like I said, started getting into drums and beats, and not so much thinking in terms of drums, but just the rhythm, was what I liked. And I liked the fact that it was kind of left field at the time. Rap was still very new, and it was just something you hadn't heard before, and that seemed extremely rebellious and extremely at times anti-melodic, and you know cool, because it's not what the grown-ups listen to. It was like, this is our thing, like kind of that sense of
Right.
ownership, if you know what I mean.
Right. Right. No,
Kudos,
absolutely. And I'll let Nick take over just because.
kudos to you, sir. Beastie Boys are one of my favorite artists of all time, and just you breaking those two out is just, I was like, oh man, this guy rules. Let's have him on some more. That was great. Great choices. I mean, Paul's Boutique is one of my all time favorite albums. I could go on for days about the samples that they chose to put on that record. I mean, like those guys are just they're phenomenal musicians, and you said it best. I mean, like as time went on, like they started creating their own music, and they did that before all that, but like they went back to their roots on like Check Your Head and all those other
Yep.
albums, but like just phenomenal artists. Like I can't say enough good things about Beastie Boys.
Man, I'm right there with you. It was a very interesting period of time in those few years before samples became a copyright issue. You had these extremely creative albums like Paul's Boutique, like
Yeah.
Public Enemy, It Takes a Nation of Millions, and Fear of a Black Planet. There's more, Old De La Soul, like where it was just you could sample anything and get away with it. And that was
Mhm.
just like in hindsight, at the time it was like whatever. But then once that was taken away because it started costing way too much money to have all those samples, it altered rap and hip hop, and
Mm,
so to have those treasures from those few years is just incredible to me.
Hell yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So,
All
so yeah.
right.
So that's I'm trying to kind of cover the different periods of time. So this is obviously a few years after, I listened to a lot of radio growing up. Like I was saying earlier, we had the top 30 in Belgium every Saturday, and I would religiously listen to that. My dad got a cassette player at some point, and I started recording all the songs I liked. So it was obviously the years of Prince and Madonna and all that stuff. Techno music, in Belgium, we had kind of a techno scene that was burgeoning. So I got into that, not really stuff that maybe stood the test of time so much, but songs like Pump Up the Volume, the UK scene was pretty big. That was all influencing me, and then hip hop. And then around that time, like not long after the first Beastie Boys album came out, my family moved to Paris in France and kind of changed my whole life and changed my whole musical environment because when I went to school there, a schoolmate of mine started introducing me to metal. Like he was a tape trader and he would just hand me stuff and stuff that was just blowing my mind. So then I went from, anything metal I listened to before that was probably not heavier than Bon Jovi or Europe, and then he started coming with one of the first ones that, I heard and that I actually purchased this very album, this copy right
Yes.
here.
Nice.
Pete Selsby who's buying, which I remember going to a little flea market in the town outside of Paris where we lived in a small town, and I just looked at the cover and I looked at these pictures. I don't know if you can see it very well with the
Yeah.
plastic, but these pictures of the four band members, they look so badass to me on there, and I was like, I don't know this band, but I got to get this. This looks killer, right? And so this is probably I'm gonna say, either 87 or 88, right? So a few years after the record came out, so I was a few years behind, but at the time it wasn't so like now where everything is super specific about when it's coming out because it's all online. At the
Mm,
time it was more like whatever you could stumble across, whatever you were lucky to find or get on a tape became a big deal, so there was a bit more spread out in time, I believe, before the
sure.
internet. So
Mm,
so anyway, Megadeth immediately stood out to me from other things I was listening to at the time. The vocals, the lyrics, just the approach was its very own kind of thrash metal, I guess, which I don't even know if at the time I really knew what that style was called. I just knew I loved it. And so that became one of my, important albums growing up, which obviously given what happened many years later in my life is kind of crazy. A cool story about that is that um, I saw Megadeth on the Clash of the Titans tour. It was one of the first shows I went to as a young teenager. So this was in Paris at the Zenith, and I have since now three times played with the band at that very venue. So every time I go there, it blows my mind because I'm like, I can't believe I was here as a teenager seeing the band I'm now a part of. And all these
right.
years later to be on that stage is just like, what happened?
Man, that's
That's
got to be so
incredible.
surreal for that to come around full circle for you, man. That is unreal, unreal.
Yeah,
And like you said, whenever you saw that album, you saw the artwork, and you were like, I have to hear this. That is definitely one of those albums that artwork would draw you in, and just like, this is awesome looking. What is this? And again, kudos to you for like I said, full circle coming around and
Mhm.
now being in the band. Like that's just so rad for you, Dirk. That's awesome.
It's beyond a dream because I would have never even dared to dream that. People will say like, "Oh, is that like your craziest dream?" And I'm like, "No," because I would have never even dared to imagine that that would happen. I was just happy
Right.
to be making music. Yeah, I was in Soilwork for 12 years before, I went to Megadeth, and I was stoked to be in a touring band and in an active professional band that was making music I liked, and so so it's beyond. You can't even put words onto that really. So when I look back at this record, and I remember having a vision of going to this flea market and flipping through albums and being like, this looks cool. There's a few other things I bought that day. I think like a Halloween album, and I forget what else. But it's just like it blows my mind to think that, wow, that if you had told me at that time, yeah, one day you'll be in that band, like, I think my head would have exploded. So yeah, pretty cool, pretty
Oh
crazy
yeah. Oh
where
yeah.
life can
Definitely a
take
great
you.
story.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I'm gonna stay within thrash metal for a little bit because I cannot go without mentioning Rain in Blood, you know,
Yes.
and I also put this one in there, South of Heaven,
Oh.
just because. So my friend that I mentioned earlier, who I was in high school with, who was very instrumental in getting me to know all this music. We would skate together. I was a skateboarder at the time. He was a great skateboarder. I was not so great, but I tagged along and had fun. And so we would, it was a typical time where we would put the boom box and play stuff right while we were skating. We had like this mini ramp that we would jump over, and we'd do street tricks and all that stuff. And we'd have the boom box and be with other skate buddies. And I distinctly remember one day we were skating near his house, which was in a different little town in the same area. And he put on this tape, and I was like, what is this thing? And it was Rain and Blood, and so it was Angel of Death, and just that, the beginning of that song with that guitar riff, and then Tamaraya's high scream, just like I couldn't comprehend what was going on. I was like, this is insane. Like, what is this thing? I need to know what this is. And Lombardo's drums immediately stood out to me as having just incredible groove and energy. Lombardo's one of my, biggest influences on drums. And so yeah, so I, of course I had to know more. I copied the tape, and later on when bought the record, and that's another one of those records that I think didn't really leave my turntable for probably a year or so, and I probably listened to that thing more times than most records. It's funny because I actually tried to listen to it the other day, and it's just the vinyl's basically fucked. It just skips all over the place because I think I listened to it too much. So, but yeah, it was just more extreme than anything at the time, and more intense, and faster, and more aggressive, and so that became really instrumental to me. Around that time I started actually playing drums. My parents got me a small secondhand kit that my dad's cousin was getting rid of. He used to be a jazz drummer and wasn't playing anymore. So my dad had noticed that I was really getting into all this stuff. And so, trying to play along to records like Rain and Blood, and later on South of Heaven was part of my roots, as a drummer. And uh, I couldn't say enough good about how well that music has aged to me. A lot of those classic records, the classic, Peace Cells and Rust in Peace, and those Slayer albums. And one of the next ones I'm going to pull out here, I think to me, I don't know if it's because of my own experience, but a lot of that music seems quite timeless to me. I don't know if you guys agree.
No, 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 absolutely. And those are
1,000%.
those are two very solid Slayer albums. Very, very solid. Um, so whenever you're saying you listen to cassettes as a kid, riding skateboards and whatever in the street, doing the ramps. I used to do the same thing. Maybe I need to take up an instrument so I can have the same upbringing, and maybe I'll be in a band that I grew up listening to one of these days. You are an inspiration to us all, Dirk, because you and
Thank
I
you.
had the same childhood as just like I need to be musically talented at something so I can join Metallica or Faith No More or something. Like
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
No, there's
it's
definitely.
crazy, like we were talking about it. You never know where such a path is going to take you. I obviously had not the slightest idea at the time. I was just stoked to be coming home from school and letting out all my frustration on the drums. That used to be the first thing I would do is go upstairs to the little side bedroom where I had my drum kit and just bang away, to
Mm.
put on the headphones, bang away to whatever I was listening to at the time, whether it was Suffocation or Obituary or Red Hot Chili Peppers or, anything really that I was enjoying at the time. I just tried my best to play along and kind of figure out what they were doing and just have fun. And,
Sure.
it wasn't anything more than that. There was obviously no thought at that point of, you know, anything beyond what was happening in that moment. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to be a professional drummer one day. It's like
Right.
that wasn't even a thought in my mind. Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, so those were. I'm going to kind of stay in the same genre and talking about skating. This is really going to be, uh, another one of
Yes.
those that like, skate punk as we would call it at the time, or skate rock or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Suicidal. I don't have the first Suicidal album on vinyl for some reason. I guess I just had it on CD and on tape back in the day. I had my CD period where I wasn't really buying vinyl, so I missed out on a lot of that stuff. But I will. I Laugh Tomorrow When I Can't Even Smile Today was still one of my favorite albums of theirs as well. The first one too, the self-titled one, and I think obviously Suicidal embodies the skate culture and at the same time thrash metal, speed metal, punk, all that good stuff that is, kind of my foundation as a drummer and as a musician and stuff I still love and go back to. And it's cool now living, all these years later. That's another one of those things that I never thought I would live in California. That also
Mm-hmm.
just kind of happened completely randomly because I met my then to be wife and she lived here. So I was like, well, I speak English, you don't speak French, so I'll just go there and see what happens. And then I'm still here. So, but it's very random, but it's cool to be, now in that place where a lot of that stuff was happening at the time, where that scene was kind of laying the foundation for metal as we know it today. And Suicidal obviously never became maybe quite as massive as some of the other bands, but to me they're very unique to this day, releasing great music. A band that stuck to their values, and Mike
Right.
is. It was cool. We did a tour with them some years ago at Megadeth, and Lombardo was actually playing for them at the time, so it was really cool to kind of be in that situation, where both bands together sharing the stage on the same tour. It just meant a lot to me. It's hard, again, it's hard to put into words to think of the young person I was at the time and to now be a part of that, and for
Sure.
those people to accept me and to regard me as one of their peers. It's very surreal.
That is definitely awesome. Now two things about what you just talked about: Suicidal and skating. So I believe I'm almost 100% positive that my introduction to Suicidal Tendencies was the music video for Institutionalized back
Mm.
in the early 90s. But after I had gotten into the band, I had discovered their Join the Army album, which had the song Possessed to Skate. And
Yes.
being the skateboarder that I was as a teenager, it was just like, hey, this band sings about skateboarding. Like, I have to get into this band, and that was what was one of my big draws about Suicidal Tendencies as a kid. Um, Now, talking about the circles that you run in, I'm almost positive that the three of us have a lot of mutual friends just because of the bands that you're in, like Brian Fajardo. I'm sure you know him.
Oh yeah.
Adam Jarvis. I'm sure you've probably had some run-ins with him. But anyway, just talking about you rubbing shoulders with Dave Lombardo. I'm sure that the three of us know the same group of people. We just didn't realize it. But once I started going through this list, I'm like, I bet money that we all have, the same people's phone numbers or whatever. But I was just like,
Yeah.
that was something I wanted to bring up at some point during the episode. Like, I'm sure we know a lot of the same people, and that's
Yeah.
so badass that just inadvertently, it's like 6 degrees of Dirk Verbeuren. You know what I'm saying? Like, we know the same people. So
Yeah. It's to me one of the beautiful things about this scene is that there's a real brotherhood in some ways, and especially I would say, not to diss any of the other guys, but especially among drummers. I think the drummers, we tend to get along, we tend to hang out, we tend to, there's not really much rivalry that I know of. I'm sure there's
mm,
some, but I'm definitely not, that kind of person, and I have immense respect for the underground. To me, this is all underground. Some of it got really big over the years, and that's fantastic because it benefits everybody that some of it got really big. It gives us all probably a license to still be doing this today,
Sure.
but it's underground. It's anti-establishment music. It's music, like I said, where you kind of feel like you belong to your own world. That doesn't include like the quote unquote normies. So that was always my draw to it. And so when you mention people like Adam, like Adam Jarvis, Brian Fajardo, I could mention a million guys like that I respect tremendously. Like Brian is just a machine. It's crazy. Like I just recently got a grid link vinyl, an old one that he plays on. He actually recorded some drums for a future Ben C song, because I have kind of a collaborative thing that I do with that. So I asked him to just improvise some drums, and he sent them to me a while ago, and I'm gonna make a song with them. So it's like,
Nice.
so I respect all those guys from the underground scene tremendously. I could have been one of those guys my whole life. My path just ended up being different, but I would have probably been perfectly happy as an artist, being in a grindcore band the rest of my life. And,
Mm.
for a while, that was kind of where I was at, like doing a lot of death metal and underground stuff. And then somehow I ended up where I am. But I haven't lost at all the respect and the connection for where I come from, where we all come from. And to me, it doesn't matter if a record is, you know, number one somewhere, or some big seller, or if it's just a really cool underground record. As
Mm.
long as it's good and the music is good and is genuine, then it's a treasure in my book.
Oh yeah,
Oh yeah.
very well put, Dirk. Very well put.
Yeah, so anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on those things. Speaking of underground, so I'm gonna get now to one of my favorite bands of all time. I've been pretty vocal about this, but this record really changed my life. And so I don't know if you can see the sticker that says uh, "World's Fastest Band." So somewhere on there. I also have "From Enslavement to Obliteration," the second album, behind there, because that was also very instrumental. These two records. So the story about Scum, the first Napalm Death album, my little story is that I used to go with some of my friends to a record shop that now doesn't exist, Virgin Megastore on the Champs Elysees in Paris. That's kind of like our place to go, because they had a lot of imports and a lot of choices. And whenever we had a little bit of money, we'd grab our skateboards, go do some skateboarding in Paris someplace, and then go to the Virgin Megastore and see what they had. And so um, I see this record, right, and World's Fastest Band. Okay, I got to get that, right, because I was super into anything that was fast at the time. And I get home and I put it on, and it just went over my head. It was probably too noisy and too punk and too all kinds of things for me to comprehend. And I remember asking my father, like, "Can you return records once you've bought them?" I mean, I was like 15 at the time, 16. I had no idea. Um, yeah, so that was Scum. And then, of course, As It Goes, which is kind of something that I miss nowadays. And I'm sure a lot of people our age do, is that at the time it was like, well, I didn't know when I was going to be in Paris next, and I hadn't quite made up my mind. So let me listen to it again, and maybe I'll try it one more time 3 days later. And then, this is actually pretty cool. And then fast forward a few weeks, and it's like one of my favorite albums of all time. And
There
I
you
think
go.
that's something, unfortunately, with streaming, that it's become so easy to skip through things that it's easy not to give things a chance. For me, some of the best music is music that you don't get in the beginning, that goes over your head, or that puzzles you, or that challenges you. I think sometimes when you can sit through that and push through that, you can discover the best stuff. And Napalm Death was definitely that for me. It was too violent and too punk and too all kinds of stuff. Like I said, I don't have the adjectives for it, but then it
Hmm.
became everything to me, because it embodies like absolute extremity musically, and just cutting all the norms, and having a 1 second song in You Suffer, and having all these really short blast beat driven songs with two riffs that are just pure energy. It's fascinating. They were able to kind of blend punk and thrash and death metal into a place that nobody had done before. And to this day, that's like a major foundational step, I would say, for the genre of music we listen to. I think without bands like Napalm Death and Repulsion and a handful of others, obviously the punk bands like DRI and who were also playing really fast very early on, maybe even before the bands I mentioned. We wouldn't have death metal and black metal and grindcore and all that stuff the way we know it, because those
Right.
bands introduced those new elements of drumming and riffing and just absolute extremity to the world. And so yeah, it became a landmark and a milestone record. And to me, I still get the chills when I put those records on, even after all those years.
Mm. No, absolutely. Scum is one of those albums that definitely has a lasting impression. Once you get it, I mean, and I can see the whole aspect of going from Suicidal and Slayer to Napalm Death. I mean, that's quite a leap. And I believe the first grindcore album I ever heard was Prowler in the Yard, Pig Destroyer,
Hmm.
Prowler in the Yard, and it was just like the first time I heard it, I was just like, I'm good for a little bit. Maybe it'll come back in a couple of days and it'll hit me. And then it did, and it just like, man, oh, what a good genre of music. But
Right,
yeah.
right. Yeah, that's it. It's I think the challenging part is important, and it's important to remind ourselves, and to maybe pass this on to younger generations to say, sometimes you got to be challenged by the stuff. You got to give yourself some time with it and not immediately dismiss it and go to something that immediately catches you. I mean, stuff that immediately catches you can be fantastic too. Nothing wrong with that. But I think you can really find your own treasures, by sometimes giving it some time. Uh, and I remember the same for like when I first heard Slowly We Rot, I was super fascinated by it, but the vocals were like, what is this thing, And then of course, like, then of course John Tardy is one of my favorite vocalists. Like, how could he not be? It's like, how, if you're into that kind of music, like he's in the top 3 or 5 or whatever, like without a doubt. There's just no discussing that, I think. But it takes some time to kind of understand those things, and I think that's cool. To be honest, I could. Do you guys remember that earache compilation, Grind Crusher?
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I should have pulled that out. I didn't pull that out, but that's like basically I could sit here and talk about the entire beginning of Earache, all the first 40 or 50 records they put out, and put everyone. And as a matter of fact, the next ones I have here, let's just move to that. Godflesh, Street Cleaner, and a couple albums later, Selfless. Those were, this took a while to sink in with me as well, because of very different kind of music. So obviously, once I became a Napalm Death fan, and the lineup on Scum and From Enslavement splintered quickly into a bunch of other stuff, and of course I had to get all of that stuff. And at the time, it was receiving flyers from Earache in the mail and sometimes promo cassettes, I remember, and then just looking at the flyers and being like, ooh, it's a new band with Justin who played on side A of Scum. Let me check that out. Or it was on Grind Crusher, maybe in that case. I know the song Street Cleaner was on Grind Crusher and I love that song, so let me get the album. And just completely challenging my perception because I didn't know any industrial music at the time. I didn't know what that was. And so stuff like that took probably years for me to really wrap my head around, where I would have it and I would feel drawn to it, but at the same time, I wouldn't really get it. And over the years, revisiting it, eventually, Godflesh is now one of my favorite bands of all time. I think they have a pretty impeccable discography. I'm fascinated by everything they do and Justin does and all his different projects, whether it's J.K. Flesh, more techno, or the ambient stuff with Final, or just he has a million different things that he does, and I'm fascinated by all of it. And it kind of, some of the stuff brought me back to, which I'll talk about later too, but brought me back to the techno stuff from the early years in Belgium. It's, especially with J.K. Flesh, is like kind of like the current day version of those things that were on the radio at the time. Sometimes kind of cheesy stuff at the time, but um, so it's fascinating to me that early scene, especially in the UK. Of course, Earache also had a lot of international bands that went on to be legendary and important. And I couldn't, There's not enough time to talk about all the albums, unfortunately, but especially that UK scene has always been so progressive, all the way back to Sabbath and Priest, obvious ones now, to like Napalm, to like the electronic scene with Aphex Twin, Autechre, and J.K. Flesh and Scorn, and etc. It's really fascinating how forward pushing and forward thinking a lot of those people were and continue to be to this day. I have immense respect for someone like Justin Broderick or Shane Embury, who just, they're never going to be, a James Hetfield or whatever, but their music is so essential and so important, and it's always going to be kind of underground, but nevertheless extremely important to me, and to a lot of people.
Just as important as James Hetfield, just like not with the mainstream, But I mean, you bring up Shane Embury to almost anybody in the metal community, and they can go on and on about stories and stuff that he's been a part of, and that's
Yeah, yeah. It's
Real,
it's it's
real
it's a
quick.
true.
Go
Yeah,
ahead. Go ahead.
go ahead, Nick.
No, no, no. Go real fast.
It's a true passion for music, that drives a lot of those people, in my opinion. And you can feel it because they're not willing to compromise, really. They might experiment with stuff, but there's never a real desire to do what needs to be done in order to get big. I mean, not that
right.
I'm sure none of those guys would really be mad if they got really big somehow, because that's cool, whatever. But that's not their driving force. Their driving force is creativity and passion for music and exploration and experimentalism. And I love that stuff. To me, that's like, as much as I love Prince and you know name any big cool artist, like I like good music, so to me it doesn't matter, if it's Taylor Swift or anal cunt, it doesn't matter. It's like,
I
if it's
love
good, if I like it, and if the music is good, and if I can enjoy it, and if I respect the what's behind it, then it's cool.
mm, mm.
Uh, Real quick, I just to your previous selection. One of my favorite quotes I've ever heard on our show. Can I return this record? That is awesome.
that's
That is fucking awesome.
that's definitely a first. I've never heard anybody say that on the show, and quite a what a quote for the landmark. Can I return this record? That's definitely going to be the tagline for this. Once the episode goes up. Um, um, a couple of things. Whatever you were talking about, discovering bands and not getting them at first, giving it some time and then coming back to it, and then you just now mentioned Taylor Swift. I'm a big Taylor Swift fan, but this goes back to my daughter and I. My daughter is a huge Taylor Swift fan, and we've seen her in concert 2 or 3 times, and I own a lot of her albums, and because of my connection with my daughter. But my co-host over here does not like Taylor Swift, and I'm really hoping that one of these days he will come around and he will finally realize the musical genius that is Taylor Swift. So
Yeah, I mean, to each their own. I
yeah,
get it. Like, I'm mostly, I know her through my wife, who's a fan, and that's it's sometimes some stuff hits you, sometimes stuff doesn't, and that's cool. It's all a personal experience in the end, and
sure.
that's the thing. It doesn't really matter. When I was younger, I was a lot more of a, you know, mostly in my mind, a gatekeeper of like, oh, this is cool and this isn't. Oh, what? It has melodic vocals? Fuck that. Like, it needs to be growling vocals and, that kind of shit. Or wait, it doesn't have blast beats? Oh, lame. Like, when you're young, that kind of stuff is, I went through a period like that. And even though I came from a very open, place early on when I was really young. So I think I quickly went back to that really open place where I was like, look, I don't have to be ashamed as a metalhead that I also like Prince and Beastie Boys and Lady Gaga and whatnot. It doesn't matter, if it moves me, and if I enjoy it, then fuck it. And you
Yeah.
know, anything you listen to too much, after a while it gets like, okay, I can use something else now.
Hmm.
Like, my
Oh
days
yeah.
of listening to death metal 24/7 for months in a row are kind of behind me. That doesn't mean I like it any less, but nowadays I like to throw on, John Coltrane record, and then a Brutal Truth record, and then maybe a hip hop record or a techno record, whatever, and just
Mm.
mix it up, and that's me now. So, or depending on the time of day, I used to wake up with scum. Now it's probably more jazz.
Right.
No, to be clear, I don't hate on pop music. I listen to Sabrina Carpenter, but it's just the Taylor Swiftness. It's just like in your face constantly. Even when I'm trying to watch football, it's in your face. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
she's dating my team's the enemy of my team. So I just
yeah.
I've had enough of her.
Yep,
I
he'll
get
come
it, man.
around.
I get it. She's become a real phenomenon, unlike many. I think you can only maybe compare maybe Michael Jackson at the height of his success, to be as phenomenal and
And
to
there's
be
no
as
again
omnipresent.
no hate on her success because like what she's
Uh,
doing is incredible. Like you can't
uh,
get that way by being a terrible artist. I'm not saying
Right.
anything bad about her music, but like,
Mm,
oh man, it's
Yeah.
so in your face. Every time she releases a new album, that's all they talk about. I'm just like, holy shit.
Yeah. I
And
get
me
it.
being
I
his
get it.
co-host doesn't help either because every time she releases a new album, like, look at this, new Taylor Swift. Like,
That's
but
funny, man. That's funny. Well, here we are in this metal podcast talking about Taylor Swift. Isn't that
hey,
wonderful?
hey, hey,
Uh,
It wouldn't be the first time.
it definitely won't be the last. But anyway,
There you go. I'm
let's
gonna
move
take
on.
it back to some blast beats now.
Ooh, what a
Here's
segue.
another band and another little bit of different style of music, and especially also a drummer that was really really influential in my years was Pete Sandoval, Morbid Angel. Uh, I could have picked any of their albums, but this one was the one where really the drumming and the extremity was taken to a different level. And I would say this also has kind of their most punk production in a way. And so Covenant's a personal favorite. I like all of their records, even the controversial ones. But yeah, Morbid Angel, that's probably one of the bands I've seen live the most. And what Pete was doing at the time, nobody else was playing that fast, that long, that extreme. And so that was really, a benchmark for me to learn to blast and learn to do fast double kicks. And just this extreme drumming was very influential on my work with Scarf, my first band and other bands I was playing in at the time, like Mortuary. And, that was everything to me for a while was Morbid Angel, and huge respect to them for creating their own, kind of subdivision of death metal that was very groovy and crazy riffs. And, Trey, musical hero of mine, Trey Azagtop. So that's I couldn't go without bringing that band. It's another one of the early earache bands that I probably discovered through the same Grind Crusher compilation. So I feel sometimes when I do this stuff that a lot of it is coming from the same place, but that's just how it is. It's stuff ends up really hitting you at different times. And I still remember getting the promo cassette from Earache when Domination was about to come out, and just being blown away by the production on that one. Was a lot more cleanly produced, which was also kind of new at the time, because for in the late 80s early 90s, producers were still, with a few exceptions, really figuring out how to make this kind of music sound good. Of course, Morris Sound was ahead of the game, hence the whole Florida scene. But again, I could have picked so many records, like we would sit here for 10 hours. So I feel bad because I mentioned Morbid Angel, and I'm like, I'm leaving out Death and Entombed and Obituary and Suffocation. And, I'm super passionate about all that stuff. So yeah, maybe one day we have to do a follow up for people that have way too much time.
I was just getting ready to say, I hate to call it now, but we're gonna have him back for part two.
Yeah.
I am so excited, Dirk Verbeuren part two.
Yeah. We might have to. We might have to. It's I mean, everybody knows these records, and I'm not really bringing anything exciting new to the table with some of these, but they're just genre defining records. There's nothing else you can say about that.
Sure, sure.
Some bands hit me more at certain times in my life. Like I remember kind of frowning upon Cannibal Corpse in the beginning because it was a bit too caveman, and I was like, oh, Morbid Angel's better because they're more technical and this and this and that. But then over the years, that evolves and changes, and now I have just the same respect for Cannibal than I do for a lot of those foundation laying bands, and so
Mhm.
it all always goes in waves. And and you realize over time that, like, bands like you said, about Taylor Swift a second ago. You don't become an institution in any genre if you completely suck. It just
Mhm.
doesn't happen. So
Right.
so I keep going back to those institutions and rediscovering them and giving them another chance and being like, oh, maybe I didn't get it 10 years ago, but now I do. And that goes all the way back to, you'll see like some of my selections later, it goes to some stuff that's very old, that for a time when you're a teenager, I don't know how it was for you guys, but I was very much into what's being done now. And like, I don't care about Black Sabbath, that old shit, like that's kind of was my stance for a few years. And then of course eventually you go to that because like people keep talking about it and you keep hearing songs, and then maybe you read a book and like, oh, it's kind of interesting, and then you put on the records and you're like, oh, I get it
There
now.
it is. There it is.
Right. Yeah, that's how it goes. So, like personally, for example, I've never been a huge Maiden fan, but of course, I cannot deny, the influence that Maiden has had and keeps having in the metal world. They're one of the biggest bands. They have their own style, their own thing going on, and I have the hugest respect for that, even though it's maybe not entirely my thing to throw on the record player, but that doesn't mean anything. It's like you cannot deny the those institutions. If you do, it's too bad, because you have to be open to things, even if they're not maybe your ideal version of that music, I believe.
Sure. Sure.
Absolutely.
So in the end it's a personal thing. I'm gonna go to another earache one. God damn it. The old earache, old. I don't know if you guys know this one, The Musical Dimensions of Sleestag by OLD. So this is a totally nuts record. It's absolutely insane. Like, if you ever throw this on, for those of you who don't know it, it's just a mind fuck. It's a complete whirlwind of madness. But I got to know OLD when they were old lady drivers with their first album, which was grindcore, and silly grindcore with silly, crazy lyrics, a lot of which would not fly now. And and then I kept following what they did, and it became, on their second album, Low Flux Tube, it became a lot more experimental. And then on this one, the third one, it became like over the top crazy. And it's the kind of stuff that, you know, shouldn't speak to me, kind of like Godflesh, like there's a drum machine, there's no drummer. Why would I, as a drummer, like that? Well, I love it. Like, I think the creativity that's exhibited there and the personal style that they have, the unique approach of James Plotkin, on guitar and bass, and just the way they wrote music, it's unlike anything else. Like, I don't think you can compare that record to, in my knowledge, to anything that exists. There might be some stuff that I don't know about. I'm not super familiar with all experimental music, not even close. But anyways, for me, it's like just mind bending stuff that took a lot of listens and then eventually becomes this cozy, soft place that you can go to because you know it so well, and it's so strange, but yet at the same time so appealing. And I love records like that. Again, these grower records that just take time to unfold and take time to wrap your head around, but then eventually become, such an intricate part of your life that you cannot imagine not having them. Like, these are the kind of records that I throw on when I just need some mental comfort, or when I just want to put on something that's not challenging me per se anymore, but that just feels good.
Yeah.
And somebody walked in on me listening this, they would be like, what the fuck are you listening to? Which is funny.
That's
Yeah.
that's awesome. And if nothing else, that is going to be the album that I take away from this episode because, as I've said numerous times throughout many episodes, one of my favorite things about the show is learning about new music, learning about music of bands that I've missed over the years or whatever. And I believe it was Cha that brought up Old Lady Drivers, but I think he just did it in passing. But yeah, I just looked it up on Spotify. That album is 9 minutes or 9 songs in an hour.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. I want to hear this album so bad now. So
Yeah.
thank you for introducing me
Yeah.
to something that I've missed out on since over the last 30
Absolutely.
plus years.
Absolutely. I hope you find something in there. It's not for everyone, and the previous one, Low Flux Tube, is a lot more accessible and has a lot of the elements that then they really go crazy with. On this one, I chose the craziest one for sure, where they went absolutely just bonkers. But
Mhm.
but actually, the next album I have by a very different band. I don't know if you guys know this one.
Ah,
Oh, my man.
Yes.
Oh,
So this
yes.
one, I I I was, I was aware of the first Mr. Bungle album. I thought it was cool. I wasn't as into it as some people around me. Some people around me really thought that was the greatest thing ever made. I thought it was great, but this one, I bought this one kind of on a whim. It was I remember I was in London with my parents at the time. They wanted to do a trip there. I was still living in France. So it was just, an easy trip to go to London. And I went to a record store and I saw this and it had a 7 inch in it. I'm sure I have that somewhere separately, but it had a 7 inch. It was like a limited edition. And I'm like, oh, that looks crazy. Like I've heard this Mr. Bungle band. I'm going to try it. And talk about a mind fuck up a record. That's another one of those where they just threw everything in the kitchen sink at the situation, and just absolutely extreme in every way, just crazy, over the top musicianship, like just mind blowing. And then the craziest thing about this record, so me and my friend, one of my early friends that still a lifelong friend, somebody I met in school, and we started playing music together. He's one of the first people. Him and my cousin Sam are two of the first people that I actually played music with. So they're both guitarists. So my friend Ian, uh, he was also really into this record. And so one day we're sitting in my bedroom throwing on this record and we're wanting to listen to a particular song. And so I take the needle and I go to this song, and a different song plays that neither one of us had ever heard. And we are
Hmm.
like, we're literally sitting there, like looking at each other, like, what is happening? Like, we thought we were in an alternate universe for a minute,
Hmm.
and then we finally realized that, yeah, they put a song in between the grooves of another song. And so the only way you could get to that song is if you drop the needle in the right place, because it's not listed on the record, on the CD version afterwards. Of course, it was just a bonus track, you know, and the song is like, oh, this is a special song, it's a, whatever, like, you found this song now, whatever, crazy crazy lyrics that were kind of joking about the song being hidden. But we had
Hmm.
never, experienced that before. I didn't know that was a thing. I later on found out that, like, Monty Python did the three-sided album where side B and C were basically in between the grooves of each other, so you would only hear one unless if you drop the needle in the right place. So the same thing, but for us this was like not something we knew, and so we were completely, like, it totally worked on us. So now we love this album even more because we were like, oh my god, we already thought this was the greatest thing in the world, and now it has this too.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, a huge, huge, huge Mike Patton fan. I try to follow everything he does. Of course, Phantom Us.
What happened?
But yeah, Disco Volante. Like as far as Bungle, it's like anybody you talk to would say, everybody has different perspectives. Like, the first album is their favorite, or Disco is their favorite, or California is their favorite. Like, but they're also diverse. They're also different. It's like they didn't do the same album again and again and again. Everyone has their own theme. Everyone has their own style or whatever. But yeah, Disco, dude. As soon as you brought that out, I was just like, I knew I liked this guy for a reason. I knew I liked Dirk Verbeuren for a reason. And anybody that brings up Mike Patton on our show is always welcome. I just huge
Yeah.
Mike Patton fan, and yeah, the secret track thing. Like I didn't realize that, but the I believe the 7 inch that came with that was the Platypus
Yep.
7 inch, and side D, or the other side B, was the Secret Chiefs Trio.
Exactly, which I discovered through that 7 inch. You're absolutely right. So there's a lot of good stuff about this very vinyl. If you happen to buy this one, it was like, it was pretty special. And it's so cool that at the time there was no internet to go, oh, there's a secret track somewhere. Like, you had to find this yourself or know somebody who
Hmm.
knew. And for me, I did a lot of my, I was an only child, so I did a lot of my musical stuff just among a small group of friends or by myself, like go to the record store and just buy something based on the cover or because I'd vaguely heard about it and I wanted to give it a chance. Sometimes you miss and you buy something shitty, but it was worth it. And this was one of
Right.
those that, like, to this day I remember those times, those moments, and just being like, this record is the absolute craziest, greatest thing. And of course, Mike Patton, couldn't agree more. I follow everything that man does. Every project he's done, they're all great in their own way. His crazy
Mhm.
first two solo albums that he did that were just complete, you know, madness. Like, I love all that stuff, just stuff that just pushes the envelope in every possible way. that is just, that is a part of what I like about music, is to really be surprised and challenged, and and just, yeah, just hear stuff that, like, what is this?
Mhm.
I love that.
I
I love
just want
that.
to say that
So
they recently re-released all the Bungle albums on color, and for the first time ever, I've actually owned a physical copy of Disco Volante. So I'm glad
nice,
you broke that out because
amazing.
Jeff was, I'm sure he told you like what Mike Patton means to him, what all those projects are. But that, uh, yeah, I'm happy you broke that
Yeah.
out. Like I said, it was the first time
Me too.
I've owned this physical copy of this album, so I'm like stoked people are
Yes.
talking about it on our show so recent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, all those Bungle records are essential. Fantomas, same thing. Every album's pretty much a completely different concept. It's all just great. It's great stuff. And I realize I forgot something really essential here, so I'm gonna go to my vinyl section for a small second and see if I can find it real quick. Uh, I
This
need to put this
guy,
in.
dude, Dirk, dude, I'm so happy we made this happen. I'm especially excited they brought up Mr.bungle, dude. I am pleased.
Yes,
This is
great.
awesome.
Happy to hear it. Let me see. Is this the one I'm thinking? Uh, oh man. Oh no, that's not. Let me see.
We're getting a tour of Dirk's room. Look, look,
All right,
look,
damn it.
look, look at all those records, guys. Look at that. Look at this.
I'm just gonna show this one. I don't have the record that I really wanted to talk about on vinyl yet, but I gotta mention Meshuggah. Um, the first Meshuggah I heard was the non EP, and it blew my mind. That was tape trading days. This is some years later after what we're talking about until now, but blew my mind with the rhythmic aspect. And so I started following them, and of course, Destroy, Raise, and Prove, which everybody loves. But then when Chaos Fear came out, that was really for me when they found their own sound, and just kind of cut all the extra stuff and became just based on polyrhythms. And as a drummer, of course, fascinating. I once spent 2 weeks trying to learn that whole record, Chaos Fear, front to back, on drums, just because I wanted to, and just because I wanted to learn how to play that stuff, and very difficult stuff. Um, but actually, the record I really, like, of course, nothing is fantastic album. I mean, all the Meshuggah albums are great in some way, but the record I really put even above all that stuff is Frederick Thornton's solo album, Soul Niger Within. I don't know if you guys know that one, but that's like kind of along the same lines as Disco Volante, just a complete unique. It has a lot of Meshuggah influences and elements, but also just completely different stuff, very experimental stuff. It's just an absolute masterpiece of a record. It's a one long 40-minute song. um, it's absolutely mind bending, and has some of Frederick's best guitar solos that he's ever done. It has an amazing saxophone solo. I cannot say enough about that record, and I've actually uh, started to learn to play that one last year. So it's super fun to learn those things on drums, because they're so challenging that sometimes you really need to sit down and just, I have to chart it out and write it down to understand what the groupings are, because a lot of Meshuggah music is in 4/4, which is like a standard time signature, but within the 4/4 they do these crazy groups of like 25, or some uneven 17 or 29, or uneven numbers, where it just keeps like messing with your head about what's
Right.
actually going on, and it repeats but in a way that messes with you, which is the whole, a lot of the beauty of their music lies in how intelligently they do that, and how well crafted, and then of course how impeccably performed it is. And so, yeah, so Meshuggah, was definitely and is definitely a massive influence on me. uh can't say enough good about them. They're also all really good friends of mine. Great people, just amazing. Like, one of my favorite bands of all time.
Oh yeah.
You'd mentioned I have two pressings of this on vinyl, but
Oh
this is a
my god.
great, this is a really incredible record, and just you know I'm glad you mentioned it because it's, I think we talked about it like barely once on our show.
Once, yeah, yeah. It
Yeah,
was
Oh,
mentioned almost in passing, but
to
yeah.
me, that is definitely in my top three albums of all time. Like, I don't know which position it would have, but it if I had to take 3 albums with me to a desert island and I could never listen to anything else again, that would be one of them, because I think you cannot get bored of that record. It's like, it's just like you can listen to that record a zillion times and still discover new things and still be blown away by at the same time, it has ugliness and beauty, and it has so many different things, and just, it's just fucking fantastic. What can I say?
For sure.
Nice. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So now I'm gonna go to something totally different, also coming from Napalm Death. So this is Scorn. This is the project of Mick Harris and Nick Bullen. Mick Harris was one of the early drummers on Napalm who played on all the early famous records. Nick Bullen played, was the founder of Napalm Death way before they were known, when they started out kind of a more, traditional punk band. Nick was the driving force behind that, and so when Mick Harris left Napalm in, I believe, '91, he met up with Nick and they formed Scorn. And this record is the first Scorn album I heard and bought, and it's called Evanescence, and it's basically the style of music, I think, that's described on the sticker is ambient dub. I had no idea what that was. I just know that, it blew my mind. Again, it went back to kind of the early, electronic music that I listened to when I was young. The stuff that was on the radio and that got really big for a minute in Europe, and that the discotheques and stuff were playing and that the kids were dancing to. But this stuff is, of course, a lot more, coming from an artistic and underground perspective, not so much a hit making machine thing, because that's never what Mick and Nick stand and stood for. But it just kind of brought me back to, oh yeah, I remember I love this kind of repetitive, ambient setting music. And again, no, I think the first Scorn album had Mick still playing drums, but starting with the second one, it was all program beats, a lot of samples, just very dark and strange music. And I became absolutely enamored with that. And that record specifically opened my whole world up to that whole scene of, bands I mentioned or artists I mentioned earlier, like Aphex Twin, everything Nick Harris does, a lot of stuff Justin Broderick does. Uh, Autechre, Square Pusher, and the list goes on. There's specific ones that I like more than others. I really like Black Lung, Australian project, David Thrussell. Um, but yeah, just a completely different, very still rhythm driven kind of music. So there's definitely that part, but it has a lot of more monotone, more repetitive droning. Maybe droning is a better word. Repetitive sounds kind of negative, but it's not at all a negative thing when I say it. It's more like just it installs an ambience, and it transports you to a different place just by kind of hammering it in. And that's something that I, for a while, as a young musician who was learning the instrument and really, working with bands and trying to get better, I had to kind of wrap my head around that, like, yeah, these guys are not at all trying to show off any musical prowess. This is purely something totally different. And I was able to understand that and integrate that into my musical understanding and language, which I think is really important. Sometimes you can get really into something and kind of start believing that, like, for example, for a while for me, like, playing technical and doing all kinds of different stuff was the end all be all, and then you realize that no, not at all. If you listen to Killing Joke, for example, amazing band. I should have put an album by theirs in here, even though I started quite late to really discover them. But it's a band that just uses very simple motives and themes, and and says so much with that. So I think that's, it's kind of like the AC/DC thing, right? Like, very simple, straightforward stuff, and yet it speaks to so many, and it's so quintessential. Uh, that's something I learned from through Scorn, and so I'm a huge fan of Mick Harris and everything he does. He has also a multitude of projects. I think Scorn doesn't exist anymore now, but he continues along those lines with, he puts a lot of stuff out on Bandcamp, as does Justin Broderick from Godflesh, as does James Plotkin from OLD. They release stuff online nowadays on Bandcamp that's just fantastic stuff, and a lot of music to discover if you're into that kind of thing.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. Scorn's another band I've never heard of. So Here's album
Oh
number
man,
two that I've taken away from this episode. So, dude,
good luck
you're
with that one because that discography is vast, my friend. Like, and it spans a lot of different things. You know, it
is that
kind of
right?
came in the beginning. The first album, you can kind of still see it's coming out of Napalm and being more industrial, and then
Mhm.
it goes, you know, like, completely somewhere else. You know, over
Hey,
time, and maybe stuff that you're gonna be like, this is horrible. But like,
that
for me,
damn Dirk Verbeuren, never listen to him again.
yeah, yeah. No, it's you know, again, it's not for everyone, you know, but for me, I've always been it's weird. I don't know how to really quantify it, but I'm intrigued by music that has a certain darkness and ugliness to it because maybe that's my way of putting that part of life somewhere. You know what I mean? I
Sure.
think even in death metal and, you know, bands like Autopsy and whatever where you kind of put all the all the ugliness, and it has a place and it's expressed in an artistic way. So it becomes something kind of tangible and something that makes sense. And so you can get that out. I think that's why people sometimes say, oh, I'm so surprised, metalheads, they're like the nicest people. It's like, yeah, because we get all our aggression out in a constructive way and we do something with it rather than holding it in and then killing someone one day or just walking around being an unhappy person. We find a
Yep.
space for that stuff and do something good with it, do
Mhm.
something that speaks to other people where we can all let those emotions out. And so the same goes for some of these projects, some of these more not all metal but more electronic or experimental projects where like some of these very strange moods and feelings can have a place and exist and actually be something.
Right. Oh yeah.
So yeah, so very passionate about all that stuff. That's always on my phone and on my playlist. And I have my periods of time where all I listen to is that kind of stuff. So,
Mhm.
but anyways, I'm gonna again go to something totally different now. So in the past years, I've been really obsessed with jazz. Maybe it's my age. I don't know. But
Oh
when I was
boy.
going to music school, so after I graduated from high school, I moved to a different city in France to go to a music school there, full time kind of modern music school modeled after Musicians Institute here in Los Angeles, kind of a similar concept. So, and that's where I first got really in touch with jazz. My dad had shown me some jazz when I was a few years before that. He had played me Take Five by Dave Brubeck and kind of showed me a few standards, and so I was intrigued. But once I was in music school, and I had one teacher in particular, Frank Aguilon, a French jazz drummer, who was one of my favorite teachers there, just an incredible teacher and player, and that kind of really opened up my mind. But for the longest time in my life, I was intrigued by jazz. I respected jazz a lot, but I didn't really understand it. I didn't really have the I guess time in my life and I was too obsessed with like other stuff to really give it the real space that it deserved. And so now the past I would say 3 4 years I've really started to really listen to jazz, really buy a lot of the classics, a lot of stuff from the 40s 50s and 60s, especially at the moment. I haven't really gotten so much to the fusion of the 70s and late 60s yet, but mostly the early stuff. And that's just been eye opening for me because it's a completely different musical language. It's kind of like classical music, which I grew up with. My first instrument I played way before the drums was the violin, and so I come from the classical background a lot because my parents were into that, and obviously my grandparents and stuff, that was their era. So that was always around, and I understood kind of that language, but I didn't understand the improv part of jazz. That kind of, I respected it and I was like, whoa, these guys are insane, but it didn't really touch me until recently, which again goes to show that like throughout the years as you evolve and as a person and you sometimes you get to a place where all of a sudden now it starts making sense, it starts clicking, and so for me there's no bad music. There's only music that maybe I don't understand yet, or maybe that doesn't touch me for whatever reason, and music that does. It doesn't matter what category it's placed under, or again, if it's famous or not, or whatever. It doesn't matter if it touches me and if it makes me put it on again and listen to it again and try to understand more about it or read about it, then it's good.
Mhm.
And jazz has definitely been very comforting for me. in recent years, the world is kind of crazy and
Mhm.
busy. I have a very busy life, as you mentioned, with the couple of projects I'm in, and and so jazz is a very comforting thing. For me, it kind of, it's I put it on in the morning when I get up, and I feed my dogs, and I kind of start my day, make my coffee. That's when especially when jazz is like nowadays the best thing for me to listen to because it kind of sets a nice tone. It's not this, like I said, I was able to wake up to Behemoth, like 15 years ago or whatever. But nowadays I need something a bit more most of the time. It still happens occasionally. I'll be like, let's go, and just throw on something really intense. But yeah, lots of love for jazz, drummers like Elvin Jones and Jack DeJohnette, who passed away recently, and so many greats. Max Roach. Obviously. Some of the names are escaping me now. So many, Tony Williams, obviously, so many amazing jazz drummers that I couldn't even reach their ankle, in playing ability, and it's such a different language, but the improvisational aspect is really something that I've been very intrigued by for many years, and that I'm trying more and more slowly over time to incorporate into my approach as a working musician. Obviously in rock and metal music, there's not often that much room for this kind of thing. But as you can tell by some of my record choices, also outside of jazz, I like it when things go crazy. So I enjoy, sitting down behind my drums and just playing whatever and doing it in a way where hopefully if it were to be recorded.
Right.
Oh, have we lost 1 2 1 2? Are we still here? Hello, hello.
Yes.
Are we
There you
still
are.
here?
I think we lost you
Uh,
for a second.
we are.
Yes.
We are.
Is it still
Real
recording?
quick follow up question to all this. We are.
Yes.
We are.
Yes. We're still
We're
recording.
good. I think
Okay,
it
good,
froze
good.
up a little on there.
Yeah.
Real
Uh,
quick follow up question to all this jazz and drumming question. Have you seen the movie Whiplash?
oh yes, absolutely. Yes, yes. Fantastic
Yeah.
movie. Yeah.
Okay.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. And yeah, it's I don't think most people can comprehend jazz in the way that the people who play it do, and I'm including myself in that. I think there's a lot of stuff that goes above my head, but I'll tell you this: some years ago, and Kiko Loureiro was still in Megadeth, he took me and our bass player James and a couple of friends to the Blue Note in New York, and a guy named Arturo Sandoval happened to be playing there, who happens to be a protege of Dizzy Gillespie, basically a Cuban immigrant in the 80s who became his own uh, established jazz musician, very well respected. I didn't know who Arturo Sandoval was. That show at the Blue Note like blew my mind, like nothing's blown my mind in many years. Just the musicianship and the not only the musical performance, but just Arturo as a person entertaining the room. Everything about it was just like, wow, this is completely different than everything I know, but so
Mhm.
amazing and so incredible in every way. So I think that really kind of pushed me to deep, dig deeper into jazz, try to understand it more, try to read about it more, and I've just become very passionate about it, which is cool because it's like, oh, now I have this thing too. It's not cool when I go to record stores because it's very dangerous. It's it's one of the things I like to do when we're on tour is, on days off and stuff, if there's record stores within Ubering distance, sometimes I'll go to one with a couple of the band or crew guys and go check out some stuff. And man, the jazz section is a very dangerous place. You can very quickly end up spending way too much money. So, but
That's
other than
funny.
that, it's great.
That's awesome. Whenever you and I met last year, and whenever I was telling you about the show, whenever we were, starting off, I don't remember how many episodes we had at the time, but you were telling me about your collection, about how you listen to a lot of Coltrane and jazz and stuff, and I'm just like, dude, if any of your fans that you listen to you for either through Megadeth or Aborted or however anybody found you, to see this side of you, to know that you listen to John Coltrane, like, dude, please be on our show, and now understandably all this time later you're finally on here, but I'm sure somebody out there is going to be like, holy shit, maybe I need to listen to jazz, maybe I need to expand my musical interest, because I mean, this drummer that I look up to because of whichever album it is.
Yeah.
This is a good thing, and I'm glad that you brought that up. I'm absolutely glad you brought that up.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. It's often like that. I asked Dave Lombardo, who's one of my, like I mentioned, one of my big influences as a drummer, what some of his influences were, and him being from where he is, he said Tito Puente. It
Mm,
was like
nice.
not at all metal in the least, but that's where he modeled a lot of his ideas after, or what inspired his rhythmical creativity, let's say.
Hmm.
So that's also when you realize that, like, some of the guys you can look up to that are so metal that it's not even funny. I mean, who's more metal than like Gene Hoglan and Dave Lombardo and Pete Sandoval? Like, no one, right? But like some of those guys model their stuff after things that are not metal at all, and that's the beauty of music, I think, is that it can come from so many places and go to so many places,
Hmm.
as long as you're open to it and as long as you're willing to listen, or like I said, or if it touches you, it's not even necessarily, that people aren't willing to listen. It's maybe some stuff just doesn't touch them for whatever reason, and that's fine. I think that's why we have so many different kinds of music, because there's stuff there for everyone. But I do encourage people to to explore if they feel so inclined, because there's a lot of stuff out there that, again, at first glance might not be your thing, that turns out to be your favorite thing later on, as I exemplified with Scum, where my first reaction was not positive, and then in the end it's like now probably another one of my top 3 albums of all time, because it
Right.
cannot not be in my top 3, because it's just so instrumental to me and such a legendary piece that can never be replicated by anyone and never will be,
Right.
and so yeah, so try stuff. um, I know we've been going for a while, but I want to talk about a couple of records that I'm involved with. So, Savage Lands, uh, Army of the Trees. So, Savage Lands isn't really a band, it's a nonprofit organization that I co founded 3 years ago. We are very engaged in protecting biodiversity across the planet. It's a very important cause to me. We've been getting a lot of good work done in just 3 short years. We've managed to buy and protect land that was threatened to be destroyed uh, in Costa Rica, in France. We're now expanding to other places too. But basically, Savage Lands, the musical project, is an extension of Savage Lands, the nonprofit. There's a lot of different people on this record. Alisa from Arch Enemy, uh, Andreas Kisser from Sepultura, John Tardy from Obituary. I play on some of the songs here as well. A lot more great guests. Basically, we're trying to, and we have succeeded already in rallying the metal scene to the cause of protecting biodiversity. That is, again, something very important to me. So please check out, if you're so inclined, savagelands.org. You can read about what we do. You can contribute in ways big or small. Just streaming the music is contributes, because all the royalties go to the nonprofit, to our projects. You know, what else to say about that? It's I think, we hear a lot about carbon emissions and plastic pollution, and all those things are valid, but what we've kind of made our mission, and what we think is really critical, is like, once you lose biodiversity, it's not coming back easily. It's going to take thousands, or tens of thousands, or hundreds of thousands of years to come back. So if we protect what biodiversity we have left on this planet, there might be a future for us. If we don't, I'm not very hopeful for the
Yeah.
human race, and all other living creatures, unfortunately. So I think it's something that's very near to my heart, and that's why I wanted to bring up this album and this project. Just kind of so people can check it out if they want to. And I know it's not maybe on everybody's priorities, but and people have different opinions about all those things, and that's fine. But I think it's undeniable that, as a human race, we're in a place where we have to start really considering sustainability, what we do. Like I sometimes tell my wife, like, when something gets made and sold, that's great, and I'm all for it, but it should also include what happens with that after we're done using it, from a food container that gets used for 5 minutes to a vacuum cleaner that we might use for 8 or 10 years. What happens with that afterwards? It gets thrown in a dump. That's great, but we're realizing that that's not a good solution. That we should try and make things so that they can either be, biodegradable, or that they can be deconstructed and partially reused, or whatever. And companies should start thinking in that way. And some companies are, of course, but on a big scale, we're still very far from being where we are in that. And as a result, stuff gets cut down, nature gets destroyed, and it's easy to turn a blind eye and to not look at that stuff, but because it's depressing when you start looking at it. So even for me, sometimes it's like, oh my god. But I think I try to use whatever little platform I have in the world to do something positive. And for me, nature and animals and wildlife, trees, that kind of stuff is stuff I love. And so that's what I've chosen to kind of use my platform for. So savagelands.org, check it out.
Awesome. Hell yeah, dude. Yeah, awesome. Cool. I'll check that out for sure. I was actually looking it up while you were talking. I'm like, yeah, I'm intrigued. I'm interested. I'm going to check this out for sure.
Yeah,
So,
I think it's a conversation that merits to be had. No matter where people stand on climate change, and everything becomes a controversial topic once it's politicized, and everything becomes a, is it real or not, whatever. And of course, there's all kinds of degrees of things, and nobody can really know the the whole truth of it, right? Because it's just too complicated to for any human to understand the whole truth. But I think it's undeniable that we are dealing with pollution issues, that we're dealing with nature degradation on a grand scale. If you look at what's happening in the Amazon, that's a very easy example because it's very big and visible. But also, this happens on a smaller scale in America and in other places, and
Mhm.
Costa Rica, where we started our nonprofit, which is a very small island, very small country, but one where degradation is very quickly visible as a result of that. So it's something that we started because it was in my co-founders, my friend Sylvain, who I co-founded the nonprofit with, it was in his backyard basically that he started seeing people just cutting down trees by the thousands to build like swimming pools and shit. And it's like, you do realize that if you cut this whole forest down, or most of it, there's going to be no more monkeys, there's going to be no more what people come to Costa Rica for in the first place. And
right.
people don't think about this because they're like, oh, I just want to put my house here. That's, of course, if you look at it like that, that's great. But if everybody thinks that way, then it's gone. So, and it's not just gonna come back. It doesn't work that way. That stuff takes time. It takes millions of years sometimes. So, or at least thousands of years. So anyway, it's I could talk about that for ages. We're here to talk about records. So let's go back to records. I want to talk about this one too. You mentioned Benzi. This is my the band's first album, which took many years to complete, but it's here. It's called The Dormant Ruin. It came out in September. I'm very proud of this one because I've worked on it for a long time. Ben C kind of started. My wife Hannah told me, "Why don't you make your own music?" Because I've been obviously part of many bands for many years and contributed musically to many bands, but never really had my own thing. And so I was in a place at the time in 2011 where there was some space and room for that. So after she kind of encouraged me and convinced me that I was good enough to do that, I was decided to give it a shot, and that's how Ben C was born. And it ended up being kind of in the grindcore vein of things. And so I'm very proud of that project. It's kind of my own expression, unfiltered, in any way. I'm not trying to sell records or do anything other than just express myself artistically. And I'm very lucky to have my good friend Sven, the singer of Aborted, as well as Shane Embury, who we talked about previously in the project with me. So they're so gracious to give their time to record, parts on the album that I'm not a death metal singer, so that's not something I could really pull off. Sven is one of the best in my mind, so it's amazing to have him. And Shane, obviously, if you're gonna have a bass player who plays grindcore, like, you know, you might as well have Shane,
You
right?
may
So
as well have Shane Embry, especially if you have an outlet for it. Sure, sure. Yeah.
yeah. So it's something that's very near and dear to my heart, and I hope people check it out. It's, again, it's not for everyone. It's pretty extreme music, but but I love doing it. You know, it keeps me fresh, it keeps me young. It's fun. It's I encourage everybody who loves music and who's maybe dabbled instruments to just be creative, because I didn't really realize this for many years, but being creative is like the essence of life. You know, whether you're creative as a painter or a dancer or a drummer or whatever it is, or in your whatever your activity or your job is in your life,
Hmm.
it's really going to feed your soul and make you feel alive to do something and to see it kind of grow and to nurture it and to evolve it and whatever that is, you know. So I always tell my students, because I do teach drums and kind of coach you know, music in various ways. I always encourage my students to start projects or to do their own thing, and several of them have, and to see that kind of flourish is amazing. It's the best thing, you know, because I think we all have that in us. You know, a lot of people think, oh, I can't do that, and of course, maybe some people have more natural, you know, ability or natural talent or whatever you want to call it to pick something up than others, and that's totally
Hmm.
normal. But I think we all do have a possibility of creativity inside of us, you know. And for me, that's Betsy kind of encapsulates that. And yeah, if anybody is listening to this and wondering if they can do it, I thought I couldn't do this either. You know, I literally, my wife had to convince me for quite a while to, because I thought, you know, I can play a little bit of guitar to write some stuff, but look at the people I play with, you know, whether it's in solo work at the time or not, Megadeth, it's like, why would I even touch a guitar when I have Kiko Loureiro in my band, or now Timo Montessori, like Dave Mustaine, you know, one of the guys who wrote the book of extreme metal on guitar. Like, are you kidding me? Like, I can't, like, it's ridiculous. I should stay away from the guitar. But she showed me that no, you know, it's like, even though I play my own way and I have zero technique and I just kind of do it self taught on my own, you know, with whatever little I remember from the violin back in the day, it's actually totally usable for creativity and you know, and so it emboldened me over the years, you know, to be like, wow, I can actually do this, and I can actually, you know, write my own songs, and I don't have to fit in anything else than what I want to fit into. You know, I can create my own stuff, and whatever I decide goes, because this is my project.
Right.
And that's really cool. You know, it's very liberating and very like, uh, you know, yeah, just a good feeling, you know, to be able to do something like that.
To have that outlet, to have that creative outlet
Yeah,
for you to do whatever you want. That's rad for sure.
yeah, because it becomes a job, you know, like it's, and I don't say that in a bad way, but when you're a professional anything, it's your job, right? If you're a
Right.
professional dancer, that now becomes your job, and there's rules and expectations and things you have to conform to, because, you know, unless if you're your own, you know, I guess Taylor Swift can do whatever she wants, you know, to mention her. But, you know, even there, you know, even there, there's like, you know, like she, if she records a grindcore album tomorrow, I doubt most of her fans will be very receptive to that. So, I mean,
Fingers
so
crossed. I'm waiting.
They would
yeah,
be like, "It's the album of the year," is what they would all
yeah,
say. They-
yeah. But I think it's cool to just, I started Ben C in not knowing what it would be. I literally was like, okay, so I told Hannah, so you've convinced me. Okay, I'm gonna try and do something. So I just sat down at my drums and recorded stuff, and it turns out that I recorded a lot of short things with a lot of blast beats, just improvised stuff, you know, and like, okay, let me see what I can do with that. So then I went and picked up the guitar, and I was like, that's interesting, because, you know, grindcore is one of my foundational styles that I grew up with, and I've never tried to make grind myself. I've played for some grind bands like Sublime Cadaveric Decomposition, which you mentioned is a band I did session work for. You
Mm.
know, there's been a couple others along the years, but I've never tried to make my own grindcore. Why is that? Like, that's crazy. Like, you know, Napalm Death was like my favorite band. I should have been doing this a long time ago. So Ben C turned out to be grind, you know, or whatever. You know, now it's a lot more than that. There's a lot more. But the early stuff was like, you know, I called the first release I did Nostalgia, because it was like nostalgia of noise, you know, like my early years. It was like an homage to, you know, kind of what I grew up with, you know, Repulsion and Terrorizer and Brutal Truth and all the greats, you know, Rotten Sound. all the greats of grindcore. That was kind of like where I was coming from. And then of course, as I keep doing it and make more music and stuff, it starts encapsulating more, having different influences, widening. As it should. Every album should bring something new, right? So,
Sure.
so the
Sure.
Dormant Ruin, the new album, has a lot more different elements in it, but it's still the essence of it is still kind of, I would say, the grindcore ethos of like having a message, having short songs for the most part, being very extreme and intense, lots of blast beats, like whatever, just craziness, and again, it kind of, I think it kind of sums up my discography that we went through kind of nicely. It has everything from Purple Rain to OLD or to Mr.bungle. It's all in there.
Nice. Nice. Well, that's awesome, Dirk. Man, that's awesome. Can't wait to check that out too.
Absolutely.
Sweet, sweet. Yeah, check it out. So yeah, that's kind of it. Again, we could do this for much longer, and we could probably go through every single record that's here. A lot of this behind me is also my wife's collection. She actually had more vinyl when I met her than I did at the time, and I think I've since caught up. But she's also a big music lover, and somebody who's constantly teaching me, showing me things that I didn't know from the past, or current things that I would probably not discover if it wasn't for her. And so I love that. That's one of the things I really love about our relationship, is that we're both very passionate about music, but from very different places. She grew up more with hardcore and punk and things that I touched upon. Should have put a Dead Kennedys record in this. Damn it. I keep thinking about stuff that I'm like, how could I not have a Dead Kennedys record in here? But anyway,
Yeah. Well,
not enough time.
I tell you what. Let me go grab a sandwich real quick, just so I can eat. But then go grab your wife and tell her to come on, and we'll just make this a 4-hour episode.
Yeah.
We'll just
Right.
But Dirk, thank you so much, dude, for your time tonight, and to learn this part of you, and to learn what makes Dirk tick. To hear about your projects, dude. This has been a blast. Thank you so much for celebrating our landmark 100th episode with us.
It's been a pleasure, Jeff and Nick. Thank you so much. It's been super fun talking with you guys about good records. Again, congratulations on 100 episodes.
Thank you.
Hopefully I can be at the one of the next 100 and come back and talk some more.
We'll absolutely make that happen.
Sweet. Thank you guys so much.
Well, thank you, Dirk, for being on the show this week. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and we will see you all next week.
All right.
Cheers.
See you guys.
Final thing,